Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Mantis podcast. I'm Rebecca Paddick, your host. In our latest instalment, I spoke to tech strategist Jessica Figueras. Jess advises startups and scale-ups on growth strategy, as well as carrying out tech futures research for the UK government. Her current interests centre on digital trust, governance, transparency, and the role of tech in civil society. During our discussion, we talked about how international technology companies can work within the UK public sector and the challenges many tech providers have faced this year. Jess ran through the types of tech public sector teams are looking for right now and what both UK and international companies can do to boost their chances of winning contracts. We also talked about Brexit, COVID, and what 2021 might look like for tech providers. Take a listen. All right, Jess, so thank you for joining me today. Could we just start, could you just give us a little overview about yourself, about your background and some of your experience?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a industry analyst and tech market strategist. I have many years I've worked with everyone from very big mature tech vendors through to medium, small tech vendors, VC funded, startups, scale-ups. Right now I'm focusing a lot on startups and scale-ups in particular. I've got a particular focus on working with government, the public sector, and kind of very regulated areas. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time advising tech companies to sell into the public sector. So one of the companies I'm working with right now is Spend Network, which is probably the global authority on public sector procurement data. So I can probably share some of their kind of recent insights. I'm also heavily involved in the charity sector. So I'm on two charity boards, one which is related to cybersecurity. And actually this year I've done a lot of work around digital trust and cybersecurity. I'm presenting some research on digital identity in local government at a conference tomorrow by Think Digital Identity. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour.
Absolutely, you sound like a very busy woman.
Yeah.
And it's been a very busy year, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. It's been extraordinary.
So if we just start there then, I suppose, so kind of reflecting on what the year has been. I think it's been quite an incredible year for kind of public sector technology, hasn't it? We've seen some certain innovations be rolled out and implemented at kind of record speed, and we've seen the way the public sector thinks about technology has really changed. What's it been like from your side? Do you kind of agree that we've made kind of real progress in the face of everything that's been happening? You know, that we've actually made some pretty substantial gains in that area this year?
We have, and in many ways, this year has shown what can be achieved quickly, very quickly, extraordinarily quickly with technology when we're under duress, you know. And that's particularly, I would say, in two places which are very, very much on the ground, which is the move to online learning in our schools and universities, and the move to online GP consultations. Now, the thought, last year that we could do either of those things on a mass scale across the country, it would have been absolutely unthinkable. But I think this year also it's been really important kind of learning, I think, because the other thing we've learned is where can that approach work and where are the limitations of tech as well. I think we've learned that very, very strongly because actually, we've had this kind of almost sort of two-speed tech take-up, right? We've seen in schools and GP surgeries, which are, not the most tech-advanced parts of the public sector by any account. They're probably the least, digitally mature, and they've moved fastest to go online. Now, if you look at central government, which is where all of the resources around tech and new tech and digital and transformation, central government has arguably performed the worst, part of the public sector in terms of its use of tech. So, we've sort of seen, the performance of NHS Test and Trace is a kind of case in point, isn't it? Perhaps we can come to speak about that later. The other place, which is frankly depressing, is the criminal justice system. We've seen, I don't know what, a huge proportion of the work of courts and tribunals just cancelled. We now have a 3-year backlog, waiting for court hearings in some cases. So, it's really shone a spotlight, hasn't it, on which parts of the public sector are, able to move that fast and which, frankly, have a long way to go.
Absolutely. It's really, like you say, highlighted certain areas that are probably a lot more tech savvy or naturally would go to a technology platform. They can implement it much faster. And it's been surprising, like you say, central government have probably struggled the most. I suppose with those areas where we've seen lots of potential then and covered lots of ground in recent months, I suppose they now need the funding to kind of back it up, don't they, to either continue accelerating it at that speed or to see the real the progress they've made. They need a bit more support now, don't they, to kind of take it to the next level, do you think?
Well, I'm certainly not going to say no, because there are parts of the public sector which have been starved of funding for many years. Education, schools is one of them. Education went into COVID in the worst shape it's been for probably decades, and yet they moved so quickly. So I'm not too sure it is just about funding, actually. Plenty of money sloshing around for NHS Test and Trace. The results have not been encouraging, have they? So I think it is more to do with how technology can be accessed by these bodies, but it's also to do with what the actual tech is. So it's the kind of lightweight, human-driven services which can move fast. An individual teacher can, if they are confident, they can stream their lesson to their pupils via, WhatsApp or, Google Classroom. It doesn't take very much to do it. Likewise, a savvy GP would probably be quite happy to use WhatsApp, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Whereas, moving the whole of courts and tribunals online, that's the reason why that's so much more difficult. Is there's a whole ecosystem there. It's complex moving parts, complex processes. Fixing that problem is not just about one worker, So I think this is what really makes the difference. It's how sectors kind of work, who has the impetus, who can make the change, who's empowered. And the issue we've seen with central government actually is just how centralised it is. People, that's really what's gone wrong there. There's too much decision making concentrated at the centre. The problem with that is when the centre is slow, it doesn't know what it's doing. Then no one can move. So I think it's very much about decentralised decision making.
That's really interesting. And we hear a lot now about kind of that person-centered design, person-centric design. So, and you touched on it there about at these kind of local levels, I suppose. The people who are in charge of that know so much more about what people need who are going to be using that technology, and perhaps centrally that's not always the case. They're just not as knowledgeable on the service that's needed, isn't it? So do you think kind of a much more localised individual kind of strategies per service is probably more successful route?
I think that's absolutely right, and I do think that will be the direction of travel for policy now. So we've seen, for example, how the metro mayors now have developed a really powerful voice, during COVID, and really the demand to kind of take back control of decision making. I think that message has been heard loud and clear. We've seen also with Test and Trace, there's sort of fairly widespread agreement that would have performed a lot better had it been handled at local level, not central. Right now, NHS Test and Trace is managing to trace 50 to 60% of contacts, of COVID positive cases. Some local authorities actually started to do it themselves. And they were reaching up to 90%. It just shows how much more effective those local programs can be. So I do think this is going to be an important trend, and actually for public sector suppliers, it's an opportunity actually to go out and explore, what a wider range of potential customers are doing. Get out of central government,
Yeah. And thinking about technology suppliers, you mentioned at the start that you work with a number of different suppliers. What's it been like kind of working with them? If you could kind of give a little bit of a recap of what it's been like, perhaps since March up until now. Has it been, we've talked about kind of opportunities, I suppose, that it's brought for suppliers, but undoubtedly there must have been lots of challenges that it's brought as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can kind of speak to some of the data here, actually, which Spend Network has been seeing. Really interesting. So the number, if you look across the board in the UK, the number of tenders that the public sector has put out, it fell dramatically in 2020. So during the first 9 months of the year, there were around 60% lower. Fewer tenders than there were in 2019, and the number of contract awards was also down by over 20%. So that's pretty depressing, really, for suppliers. And that is simply the effect of a public sector which is in crisis mode. Public sector bodies just struggling to keep up with the volume of work that's required to be able to look after vulnerable people, and so all sorts of tech projects just will have been put on the back burner simply because of lack of capacity to manage those projects. So that's a bit depressing, isn't it? But I think that there are some kind of broader trends though, which I do want to point out, because I think it's good to kind of look at the longer term changes, and some of these have been very positive. So what's interesting is that since the introduction of G-Cloud 6 years ago, we've seen that the public sector tech market, has become much more competitive. Now, for those with long memories who might remember, in 2010 when David Cameron's government came in and there was a big push to increase the competitiveness of the market, there was huge concern that too much of tech was sort of sewn up by quite a small number of vendors, the likes of Fujitsu, Capgemini, Capita, and so forth, running these very big contracts. Now, a lot of those contracts are still around, but actually what we've seen is the average number of bids for your typical tech tender has gone up by 30% in these years, which is really good news, because that means that it's had a very democratizing effect on the market. It means that there are more opportunities now for suppliers to get involved and win business. So that's a really good thing. And actually, what's interesting about this is how tech is actually quite an outlier here. If you look at other parts of the public sector market, professional services, business consulting, actually the reverse is happening. So Spend Network's data shows quite clearly that, public sector consulting, business consulting, has been getting much less competitive in recent years. And that's bad news for small suppliers, because it means that so much more spend will be locked up in a small number of contracts. So the tech market, something is going right there, isn't it? So I think that is good news. I think we've definitely seen some worrying signs this year of kind of backpedaling on competition. We've seen lots of headlines, haven't we, about contracts just being awarded directly without competition. That seems to be very associated with kind of COVID related contracts. Something like Spend Network found that well over 60% of COVID related contracts were just direct award with no competition. So, we're very much looking to government here to kind of to get back to business as usual, because the UK is generally a good place to do business. It's generally very open and competitive, open to new suppliers.
So that kind of relationship then between the public sector teams and technology suppliers, we've seen that the environment in which they work has changed kind of rapidly and is still evolving. Has that relationship changed? Are public sector teams, still, do you think, from perhaps maybe some of the headlines that have come out this year about technology suppliers that the government is selecting kind of centrally. Do you think those local teams are kind of thinking differently or talking to technology suppliers differently? Has that changed?
I think there is a perception, isn't there, which is really unfortunate, that, you know, it's become about who you know rather than what you know. I think this is such a shame because, as I said, the UK had a good reputation for being very open to competitive, to competition, to running, you know, kind of fair procurement processes. So it's unfortunate. I think that everyone is very much expecting, you know, central government to show leadership by very much, you know, resetting, getting back to the normal state of affairs very quickly. I think, you know, we all recognise that it's been absolutely unprecedented this year. And, you know, you can understand the need to go to direct award, to move very quickly. You know, it's completely understandable. But yeah, I think particularly with some of these contracts haven't necessarily been seen to deliver very good outcomes. You know, I would hope that we've learned something about contracting when your back is against the wall, right?
Yeah, perhaps then that might have created that much needed opportunity, do you think, for people to look a little bit wider? And as you say, it's understandable to have to react very quickly in a crisis, but perhaps once we're past this second wave, and when we move into next year, is there more of a chance for reflection to actually change that existing system as well of how we take on new suppliers?
I hope so, and I would also hope that going back to what we talked about earlier in terms of kind of localism, you know, and more of a demand for, you know, local bodies, grassroots organisations to have more control. I think it's part and parcel. What I would love to see is government particularly giving more money to local authorities, you know, to commission. And to the you know, combined authorities, to the cities. It would be really, really good to see more innovation coming out of those areas rather than necessarily being kept at the centre. And I do think, you know, the centre has been burnt, hasn't it? I think, yeah, I would like to see change on that front.
Yeah. At Mantis, as you know, we work with lots of technology suppliers throughout the public sector. This year, particularly in the last sort of 6 months, we've been approached by a number of international technology suppliers who are really keen to work with UK government. I've got a few questions on this actually. Firstly, is it more challenging for an international supplier to work with the government than, say, a UK-based supplier? And then also, how can they go about, you know, how do they increase their chances of success, I suppose, of winning a contract? What advice would you give them?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a I think if there's a gap there, it's a knowledge gap, and that knowledge gap can be plugged. I think it's knowing what you need to know, isn't it? So, you know, it was the UK that originally championed the idea of being open to competition. It was the UK absolutely that was behind you know, all of the aspects of kind of open procurement that we know and love now, like OJU, you know, even as we leave the EU, you know, it's important to remember that. So fundamentally, I think the UK public sector is still open for business. It is open to business to suppliers wherever they come from. But, you know, all suppliers, and this applies just as much to British ones as it does to anyone else, is that you know, what's needed is keeping a kind of firm eye on the day-to-day political trends in the UK. The public sector is in a really dynamic state right now. You know, we've seen some extraordinary upheaval over the last few months. Policy is changing day by day. You know, we're sort of seeing kind of major structural change as well, at a much faster rate. So this year, for example, you know, if you're a supplier that sells into central government, you've had to deal with a merger between Department for International Development, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, sort of kind of pretty disruptive there. You know, the next thing that's happening is the Public Health England is being rolled into a new National Institute of Health Protection. So again, if you're a supplier that's going to be selling into central government, getting on top of who those buyers are, what are they there for? What are their political priorities? What are the pressures they're under? That's the most important thing. And you can do this with the right help. Absolutely.
Are there any kind of partners or associations or groups that you would recommend international suppliers kind of looking into or joining, or even kind of linking up with to help them, as you say, plug that knowledge gap initially, but then kind of to start making inroads in the right places?
Yeah, so I think the key thing is finding partners who can help you to build that market map, to understand what your market looks like, what the organisations are, the sectors, how to reach them, to build stakeholder intelligence and that sort of stuff. And, clearly I'm biased, but I would recommend Mantis PR as being an excellent partner for that.
Thank you.
You guys really, really know the field so much better than anybody else. And I think it really is, the UK public sector is a fascinating sector. It's very diverse. And I think, just being able to get a handle on what's there, this is a sector where the users are, as diverse as, officers working directly on the ground with vulnerable people, civil servant trying to understand trends across millions of people, scientists blowing things up in fields, it's a really interesting space. So I think, partners who can help you to really understand that.
And we're all, as you say, public sector in this country is so interesting, but it's all at different levels, isn't it? Some are strides ahead, others are still very, I don't want to say skeptical, but scared maybe of technologies even now. So it's changing and evolving all the time, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, new pressures, new thinking, and thinking has really changed this year. I think the market is going to be very, very different.
Yeah, you mentioned Brexit, that word earlier, so it only feels right to talk about that again. So obviously we heard about it every single day of our lives for a significant amount of time, and then a lot of this year our focus has rightly been elsewhere, but now it's obviously back on our agendas again. So for looking ahead to next year then, what does Brexit mean for the public sector tech?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So, we're back in the realm of scenario planning, aren't we? And it's depressing, frankly, that we're still here after 4 years, but here we are. We're still waiting to hear if there's going to be a deal. So fundamentally, suppliers need to plan for, 2 scenarios here. Well, in fact, 3 scenarios. We could, the transition period could be extended. That's certainly possible, in which case no change. Or we get a deal, or we crash out without a deal. So a no-deal scenario would be very negative. As we've seen with COVID, what happens when you're, put into a kind of emergency crisis mode is that public sector bodies just simply stop doing any new tenders for projects that they don't actually strictly have to do. Lots of projects are deferred, so that's kind of negative. Public sector bodies across the piece will be dealing with the fallout, and so remember what we saw with COVID was that, tech that offers really immediate gains is kind of prioritised, whether that's, as we've seen rolling out, giving access to Zoom to all of your users, that can be done quickly. Complex projects that take months to deliver get deprioritised. So that would be quite a negative scenario. If there is a deal, again, the amount of clarity here is very limited. What we do know is that the government is aiming for, a hard form of Brexit. We know that they're looking for a free trade deal covering goods but not services, and most of what tech does is counted as services. So, the 2 big areas to watch here are regulations around data flows, and the second one is around people and movement of people between countries. So we know that the government wants to maintain what's called equivalence on data, and so seeking equivalent status from the EU will mean that we can keep data flowing backwards and forwards across borders, which will enable kind of cross-border trade to happen. If we don't get that, we'll be in a bad place. And that is the reason why many bodies have spent the last 4 years actually looking at bringing data back into the UK, data residency. The other part of that is around free movement. So, as we've seen, the regulations around immigration have already been changing. And we've seen we've seen thousands of tech workers already leaving the country. Many of them moving back to Europe. So the skill shortage is probably one of the things that the tech sector is most concerned about, and of course this will affect suppliers. Of course, what we might end up having is, since we've all become so comfortable with remote working, it might well be that the same people continue to work on the same projects, now based from Berlin, Lisbon, Barcelona, Latvia. That may well happen. So yeah, it is a concern. But having said that, I think many businesses have been anticipating some of the changes for some years now.
Absolutely, yeah. We had quite a long build up to it, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that just had something come to me just towards the end there when you were saying about kind of people perhaps they're going to be sort of, because of the pandemic, that we've had to face a completely new set of challenges. Is that, I suppose, made us a little bit more resilient, perhaps, to the changes that may lie ahead with Brexit, and particularly for technology suppliers? We've had so many challenges this year already. Has that made the market a bit more robust, I suppose? Well, we don't know, do we? We don't know. This has never happened before. We have nothing to go on, do we? I don't know. Perhaps we have more tolerance for uncertainty, I guess, on a personal level, I would have thought. Yeah. It certainly feels like it, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So looking ahead then, we've talked about all the challenges that have happened this year and possibly how it could kind of how it will roll over into next year. But if it is, I suppose, quite a difficult question, but is it potentially, for when we're looking at technology and tech in the public sector in particular, there's lots of opportunities and potential positive outcomes for next year, isn't there?
Yes. So I don't think that next year is going to be a big spending year, but I do think it will be quite formative. And in terms of spending, I think it's good to be aware that actually spending really doesn't change very much year by year anyway. So but I do think it will be formative. I think particularly if the very promising signs we've seen around the vaccine, materialise, I think that public sector bodies will start to come out of emergency mode and start to finally have the bandwidth to kind of plan again for the future. And this year has exposed kind of so many, I guess, often a lot of kind of latent needs, which kind of needed to be fixed. And but this year really is going to shine a light on. And I think next year is the time when that stuff is going to be front and centre, and government is going to be asked to solve a lot of new problems. So I think this year, this is the time. It's the time for innovation, I think, for suppliers. I think it's the time to engage with the public sector, to share ideas, to share innovations, to work on innovative ideas and to help the public sector shape the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard lots about different kind of areas of the public sector this year, most notably healthcare, as you would expect. And lots of innovations there. We've talked a little bit about local government and education, of course. And recently in the media, we've seen lots of talk about the importance of kind of integrating health and social care and that kind of interoperability message, isn't it? Making sure technology links up across public services. Do you think there will be one particular focus for next year? Will there be an area of the public sector that gets more attention when it comes to technology, or is it going to be, do you think we'll start to see kind of changes across the board and across services?
So I think that the area which is, well, it's already getting more attention, isn't it? Is a whole area that I would kind of classify as kind of safety, public safety. And I think that brings together health in a big way, but also all of the areas around policing, national security and borders, which I think we've spoken about less this year, but there is so much happening on this front, and a lot of it it's creating a lot of concern, amongst civil liberties groups, civil society generally, around the increase generally in kind of public surveillance. We've heard a lot about how people are kind of accepting various kind of forms of tracking with COVID now. It's becoming very, very normal. That perhaps we wouldn't have accepted before. And there are, calls for that kind of tracking of citizens to be extended to other areas, to police, for example. So there's a lot of concern there, but equally, I mean, the demand for it is absolutely unstoppable. And a lot of this has been enabled by important legislative changes over the last few years, particularly the Digital Economy Act in 2017, which created for the first time a legal permission for public sector bodies to share data with each other. So that whole area, I think, around surveillance, data sharing, data analytics, this is where it is at in the public sector, and there is so much to do here. On a practical level, we know that the lack of data infrastructure at a national level is kind of really holding back progress. But equally, the level of concern also, around ethics is needs equal attention, and I think those two things aren't mutually exclusive. I've seen like a lot of interesting innovation in areas like digital identity, for example, around privacy, and there's so much interesting technology and interesting thinking that's coming in this space. So I think this is one of those areas, I think, where suppliers who've got innovative ideas should absolutely be getting out there and socialising them and talking to public sector about them.
Brilliant. It's quite an exciting time, actually, isn't it, for tech to see and to hear all of these ideas coming out. Is a really good forum for it finally, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think that's right. I think public sector tech is more interesting now than it ever has been, actually. And I think that is because it's become democratized. We talked earlier about how it's become so much more competitive now. So much wider range of suppliers can get involved. That's been really, really good for the public sector, as well as obviously the suppliers themselves. But I think also what we've seen is the conversation has broadened out to encompass a wider range of stakeholders now. So, to take the conversations around ethics, that's really exploded this year. We've all noticed it, haven't we? We've noticed the worries about algorithmic bias, for example. It's making for a richer picture. And it means that, for suppliers, particularly those who aren't familiar with the public sector market, there's a kind of wider range of things they need to pay attention to now. 5-10 years ago, your typical supplier really wouldn't have to think very much about politics. They really wouldn't have to think very much about what campaigning and civil society groups were doing. Now they really do need to. The other thing that's happening is public sector bodies are much more interested in what's been called social value. So when they put work out to suppliers, how are those suppliers performing as good corporate citizens? Can they contribute to the government's net zero target, for example? Are those suppliers investing in the skills and training for their workforces? How do they treat their workforce? Do they pay them fairly? All that kind of stuff. I'm seeing a lot more interest in that from public sector procurement professionals, actually. So this is another area to keep an eye on.
Interesting. And we've talked about what might happen next year and where the focus will be. What's your focus for next year? What have you got planned? What's on the horizon?
So, so next year, alongside continuing with my 100 different jobs, I am almost certainly going to be working on my own startup venture. I can't say more now. I would love to come back and tell you about it when I've got it off the ground. But it's going to be a tech for good company based on open data, quite related to what I was talking about around social value.
Brilliant, that sounds exciting. So you decided you weren't busy enough and you just got to start something else as well, is that right?
This is the year of doing everything at once, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant, Jess. Thank you for that. Is there anything that I haven't touched on that you think is kind of particularly relevant or important, particularly for those international tech suppliers or just the public sector tech kind of arena at the moment? Is there anything I haven't mentioned?
I suppose I think if there's one kind of thing I guess I would sum up, I think is that perhaps this year has been a kind of year of reality, as far as the kind of promise of tech in public sector goes. It's been a year when we've kind of tested, we've tested like a lot of our thinking and assumptions against, this kind of very extreme emergency scenario. And I think it's really important to take to take those learnings seriously. I think that we've particularly seen this in health, where I think before COVID we were tending towards a kind of tech solutionism kind of thinking. Solutionism is the idea that pretty much any social problem can be fixed given the right technology. Enough kind of focus, enough smart people doing the right technology. And it's a very seductive idea, isn't it? It's when you're looking at areas like the multiple kind of challenges we face in the UK around health and social care, the ageing population, and so forth. I think the idea that if only you can roll out modern technology everywhere, all of this can be solved. It's very attractive. But this year we've really come up against the hard limits of that idea, and I think that's good. What we've seen is the most positive, most cutting edge developments are all far away from central governments. We've already talked about what happened in schools and GP surgeries. Very excitingly, actually, in clinical science, we've seen, haven't we? The incredible pace of vaccine development. We've never seen anything like this in history, I think. And that's where really useful application of AI, for example, has come into its own. But back in the kind of real world of these kind of thorny, gnarly problems we have around ecosystem and infrastructure, we have some very systemic issues which require that just cannot be fixed with tech. We've seen that with test and trace. I think the initial government response to COVID assumed that modern digital tools were going to be the answer. The most efficient way to do that would be a single nationwide solution, and both of those assumptions were wrong. The issue really was about the inability to get the whole ecosystem, firing all cylinders, the lack of standards. Very much issues around data interoperability, frameworks for data sharing. And those kind of problems can't be fixed with tech. They have to be fixed with old-fashioned political skills. It's about stakeholder engagement. It's about ecosystem building. It's about the hard, boring work of getting people into a room week after week, real kind of long-term commitment. And that's where we need to go next, because until we can fix that stuff, the lack of the lack of kind of standards and frameworks around data, that's going to really hold back the pace of tech innovation in health and in elsewhere. We know that there are so many suppliers who are ready to go on this stuff, that have the tech, that have the knowledge, but are just waiting for standards. So I hope very much that 2021 will be the year the government gets on top of that and we see some real leadership around data in particular. And let's hope that sets the pace for the ongoing success of the tech industry.
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. Let's hope so. Jess, lovely to chat to you. Thank you so much. Good luck with your new venture next year, and I look forward to hearing all about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.